look at what our local governments are doing. So we have Rachel DiFranco, the sustainability manager for the city of Fremont, who will be sharing their mandatory solar new home construction ordinance.
All right, so who here is an expert on energy codes? Yeah, so aside from Amy, most of us are probably more like myself where, I think maybe the alternate title of my presentation should be everything I know about building codes I learned from Build It Green a year ago. So, I hadn't dealt with energy code updates previous to this building code cycle. This is my first experience in really understanding the process, and I hope that I can kind of convey to you through my presentation that this can be a lengthy process, but it's doable for somebody who isn't necessarily as well versed in the code language as someone like Amy Dryden. But we all have the ability to do this, and now we have a lot of tools that are coming out of consulting firms like Build It Green and Energy Solutions, and help with BayREN to actually do this work in a much more simplified fashion than previously. So let me see here. Am I using the arrows? There we go. Okay. So just quick overview. I'm going to talk a little bit about Fremont and the context for why we decided to take on energy reach codes, and then specifically talk a little bit more about why we focus on residential solar, and then go through the adoption process. So for those of you who don't know, Fremont is the 4th largest city in the Bay Area and the 9th largest city in California, but we're pretty residential and suburban in nature. We're working to urbanize our community right now, and going through a lot of growing pains doing that. Our current population is over 230,000. And we're 92 square miles, so we're pretty spread out. We actually were 5 different townships that came together in 1956 to form the city of Fremont. So, thinking about a lot of the urban infill that we've experienced in the past, 30, 40 years, as well as some of the new development that's happening, and how do we really move that to a much more sustainable and urban form of development is a huge question that I constantly face. So just to give you a quick background, like probably every city in the room here, we have a climate action plan we passed in November 2012, but prior to that we did our general plan update, and I know some folks are going through the general plan update process now. Our general plan actually puts sustainability as the opening chapter of the entire plan, and we have this vision to transition Fremont from an auto-oriented suburb into a sustainable, strategically urban and modern city. So simple goal, I'm charged with this. So, we're going to make it happen in 2 years. No, there's a lot of work to be done, and we all have, some really lofty goals in this room, and California is leading the way. The Bay Area is at the forefront of that, and so, it's in our hands to really think about what can we do to move that needle even further and serve as an example to not just our neighbors within the Bay Area, but also to the larger community, especially in the face of some of the national inaction that we're seeing. Our emissions, most of you probably have pie charts very similar to this, mostly our building and transportation sectors. So those are the areas that I'm focusing on. And I like this slide because it helps to kind of put in context on the residential side why we're focusing on emission reductions in the built environment and in the transportation sector. So if you were to look at homes in Fremont, on average a home emits 3.65 metric tons of carbon dioxide every year, and each passenger vehicle emits 4.75 metric tons of carbon dioxide every year. If you were to add all of that up, for Fremont alone, it would take over 1,000 square miles of forest to sequester that amount of CO2 annually, which is 2/3 the size of Tahoe National Forest. So every city has a big responsibility to reduce emissions, which is not something that we're unfamiliar with. I just want to put this up here because I really like this map. I got zip code +2 energy usage data on the residential scale aggregated from PG&E, and I was able to heat map it so you can see which neighborhoods in Fremont are higher energy users. This helps to kind of do a little bit more targeted marketing. So going a little bit deeper into why we focused on solar. This is the graph of current solar installs in Fremont, and it shows that really since 2013 we've seen a rapid increase, especially on the residential sector, for solar installs. We have over 3,000 homes now that currently have solar installed, 70 businesses, and that totals to about 22 megawatts of solar. And I haven't pulled the 2017 numbers yet, but we were seeing probably about somewhere between like 50 to 100 solar permit applications a week. So I also got data from permitting and put dots on a map where all of our residential solar installs are currently on existing homes. So, you know, for the most part, it's pretty spread out. You can see sort of in the center of Fremont there's not a lot of solar. That's because that's more, you know, small businesses and multifamily. But for most of the residential developments, we have a pretty good spread of solar. I also want to mention, because we are talking about the overlap between energy efficiency, renewables, and transportation so much these days, that there's a huge overlap between solar and PV. And so this is a chart that came out of the Center for Sustainable Energy when they did a survey a couple years back for the folks that were utilizing the clean vehicle rebate. And the number of people at that time who were purchasing EVs, 93% of them owned their homes. I think that has gone down a little bit since, as EVs have become a little bit more accessible in price. There's starting to be more multifamily charging, but I didn't have an updated statistic here. But 32% of those in their homes that had EVs had already installed solar, and another 16% were planning on installing solar. We have a very large EV ownership level in Fremont, and so thinking about how do we make sure that we're offsetting those vehicles in addition to the building energy usage is a big question for us. So here's some stats. You know, through the end of December, we had over 5,000 EV drivers in Fremont, just according to the Clean Vehicle Rebate Program, which doesn't necessarily capture the people who are now buying EVs that are used, you know, coming back to the dealership after the end of their lease, or for the people who are above the income cap from the Clean Vehicle Rebate Project who are still purchasing EVs and not getting the rebate. And our 94539 zip code, which is the southern end of Fremont, has more EVs than any other zip code in California, or I think the nation. And this is another heat map I did of EV ownership in Fremont, which if you were to kind of overlay with the energy usage and the solar PV, you can start to see some interesting trends in terms of the high energy usage households also tend to have more solar and also are now purchasing EVs. So thinking about how do we go deeper on existing buildings is a big question, but then again, you know, this is talking about new construction and how do we make sure that we're kind of getting ahead of what the trends are already telling us. Finally, for new residential developments, you know, we're thinking about what's happening between this building code cycle, which is the 2013 building code, or sorry, the 2016 building code that went into effect at the beginning of this year, and then the 2019 building code, which will go into effect on January 1st, 2020, where we are supposed to be seeing the ZNE code actually come into play. We have over 6,000 new residential units that will be developed during that time period. How do we make sure that we're not missing the gap? So this was a big question for our city council. You know, we're facing a lot of backlash now in the community with the amount of growth that we're seeing, especially new homes, and people are constantly asking how's the city making sure that this new development is actually sustainable? How is it not, you know, over-utilizing our local resources? So thinking about mandatory solar is one way to address that. And you know, if we can get 6,000 new units to install solar, that's twice as many homes as we currently have with solar for existing construction. So the process. I have like about, I think, 4 different slides that go through the timeline. So I'm not going to talk through them in detail, but just to start, you know, spring of last year, we began to really think about the building code adoption process and started to talk to our sustainability commission about some of the potential energy reach codes and green building reach codes that we could think about. So we actually, in the fall, brought in Amy Dryden from Build It Green. We also brought in Ed Pike from Energy Solutions to talk to our Sustainability Commission about what some of those opportunities might be. And we also started to interview other cities that had mandatory solar ordinances to think about how could we do this in Fremont. So here's a list of the cities that had mandatory solar prior to this building code update. There were 7. One, Culver City, had only a commercial solar ordinance, and it's pretty minimal. And then the others, for the most part, with the exception of San Francisco, had this sort of watts per square foot, either of the building footprint or of the conditioned space of the building. And then San Francisco had this better roofs ordinance. So it talked about solar PV, solar hot water, green roofs, and I have all the details listed out on the slides. So I'm not going to go into it too much, but if you want, I can send you the kind of further developed out spreadsheet that I have here that talks about the code adoption process for each of these cities as well. So moving along, we went through, talked to these different cities, and brought forward to our Sustainability Commission some of the potential code options. So our Sustainability Commission recommended mandatory solar and an electric vehicle reach code ordinance, and then also a reach code related to outdoor lighting for non-residential construction and also for retrofits. They also considered cool roofs, which Amy had on one of her slides, and decided that they wanted to leave that as a possible pathway for developers to actually be able to achieve some of their code requirements. And so we didn't want to, layer on to kind of all of the other requirements that we were putting in place to say, you got to have solar and a cool roof and EV readiness. Let's leave the cool roof piece alone for now, but maybe address it later with another building code update cycle. Did I miss anything on there? So sorry. So then as the Sustainability Commission made their recommendations, we brought our building code update, as the entire California building code, to council in October and adopted it in November. But at that time, we were also learning that the California Energy Commission was working on this template solar ordinance that would go alongside of this new cost effectiveness study. And so we peeled back the mandatory solar requirement from the full building code update process and said, let's really kind of dig into this a little bit more, align with the template ordinance, and then bring it forward in the spring when it's really ready to go, so that we can make sure we're aligning with other cities who may also be doing this. So Amy talked a little bit about the 2016 cost effectiveness study already, but essentially, it talks about sizing PV systems based on this TDV value, which all of you are experts in now, right? I can't talk about TDV very well either, but essentially, we're talking about making sure that the size of PV that is installed on new units is not oversized. In no circumstance will the PV that's being installed overproduce for that unit. So essentially, we're meeting minimum energy needs of the buildings, and if somebody were to be a high energy user, then the PV system that's being installed under this ordinance is maybe only going to offset a portion of their electricity. You already saw this, so I don't need to talk about it. But essentially, we're in climate zone 3 in Fremont, and probably most of the cities in this room are. I think maybe some of the Bay Area cities are climate zone 4 and 12. So you can see, it's cost effective in all of the territories, but especially it looks like climate zone 4 is even more so than climate zone 3, just because you're over the hill, Contra Costa County, you get a lot more sun than Alameda County. Same with multifamily cost effectiveness, and these are just the charts. These are all in the cost effectiveness report, so if you want to look at the specific numbers, you can dig into it more. So the conclusions really said, solar is feasible in new residential development and it's cost effective, and cities can pass a local ordinance to require mandatory solar as long as you first meet the mandatory energy code compliance without using the PV compliance credit, which Amy talked about, and that these PV systems are sized based on the capacities of the cost effectiveness study. So the template ordinance is designed to be aligned with this cost effectiveness study, and it applies to residential building types, both single and multifamily, low rise. So that was actually three stories and under. And it has prescriptive system sizes for any buildings that are up to 4,499 square feet. Above that, then you go to this percent TDV calculation, which developers understand how to calculate, so I didn't have to explain that to them. And the ordinance can also be adopted as is or with some modifications. So we talked about what possible modifications we could do in Fremont. These are the system sizes for climate zone 3, so you can see, for a home maybe 1,500 to 2,000 square feet, we're talking about a 2.1 kilowatt system, not super huge. I think that average installed system in Fremont is for residential is about 5.5 or 6 kilowatts. So these are, like I said, minimal size systems, but it at least gets us to kind of the next building code update cycle. So what we looked at for modifications was to say if you can't go solar, or if you don't want to go solar, you can still meet this requirement by increasing energy efficiency. So you can meet the CalGreen Tier 1 energy efficiency requirements, which is 15% above code. And you can meet the requirement with other renewable energy systems aside from rooftop solar, so that could include, ground-mounted or carport solar. We also have a renewable energy ordinance that we passed in Fremont in 2012 that allows wind systems, so you could do small wind systems. And then also we really wanted to think about the fact that for the most part these are going to be really minimally sized systems, and for somebody who's buying a new home, single-family home in Fremont, they may want a much more sizable system. So we said in our ordinance that we want the developer to offer expanded system sizes to the buyer, and we also wanted to think about what the possibilities could be in the future for somebody to add on panels to that system. If you're building solar in a new home, you're not necessarily going to be running conduit. You're going to run that wiring directly inside the wall. So if you wanted to add new panels, you would still have to run new conduit, and you may not have a pathway. Under the current building code, we have requirements for having a solar zone and a solar pathway. And so what we said is meet those requirements still, even if you are installing solar, so that if somebody wanted to add more panels later, it would be easier for them to do it. And we also encourage use of what we call expandable system sizes, so encouraging the use of, for instance, microinverters, so you could more easily add on panels later without having to add a new inverter or replace an existing inverter for a larger capacity. Oh, and then also we encouraged an all-electric building design so that you could even further maximize the benefit of solar. If you were to offset all of your energy needs with solar, then we're not worrying about the natural gas footprint of the building. So finally, actually I think there's one more timeline after this, but by March we brought the updated ordinance to our Sustainability Commission with these modifications. They said, okay, great, that sounds awesome, push it to the council. So April 18th, Earth Week, we brought it to council. They actually passed it on consent. I didn't even have to present, which was amazing. And then we filed the Energy Code Amendment documentation with the CEC. So you have to show that there's a cost effectiveness study that backs up your, REACH code ordinance. And then I, since I didn't have experience doing this before, realized that when we did our findings for the overall building code update process, we didn't have anything in there that specifically referenced solar and the energy code and why this was, necessary for the city of Fremont to do based on our local climate conditions. So then I brought a series of findings to council in a separate resolution to say, this is why this is important. Climate change is real. There's all these climate vulnerabilities that we experience in our community, and in order to offset that, mandatory solar will help us get there. So that went through, again, on consent calendar, and I'm filing that with the Building Standards Commission tomorrow. and the California Energy Commission has to have a 60-day review and kind of open comment period for any filings to the Energy Code as a REACH code. So we're scheduled to actually have our ordinance go to the California Energy Commission business meeting on July 12th, which it will then be enforceable. So I don't have any experience in enforcing this yet, but that's the process. And again, just to kind of reiterate, I think what Amy started with, which is, this ordinance is really aligning us with the California goals of, residential ZNE by 2020, and thinking about our California Renewable Portfolio Standard, which says 33% renewable by 2020, 50% by 2030, and then also our statewide GHG reduction goals. So I think that's my last slide. And then we go over to Kathy, right, before questions? Okay, thank you.